There are bells in Oxford that sound like memory. Balliol's, for instance, has a note that drifts rather than tolls, dissolving before it reaches the air's edge. I remember it that evening, a faint, tremulous sound caught in the damp, turning mist into something almost sentient. The city was half dreaming, half dying of autumn. Students hurried beneath umbrellas, their laughter distant, brittle, like the last pages of a play, read too often. I was in my rooms, the light low, Parsifal on the gramophone, and a glass of claret deepening toward melancholy on the desk. It was the obituary that caught me, not a headline, not even an article, merely a footnote in the Oxford Mail. Professor Ambrose Keating, Fellow of Balliol College, passed away in his study last night. He was 71. No mention of cause, nor of the peculiar beauty of his prose, which had once held entire lecture halls silent. I had attended one of those lectures as a young man. He spoke of Yeats with a restraint that bordered on devotion, yet there was something incomplete in his voice, as if even truth required editing. I did not know him well. We had spoken only twice. Once about a misattributed quotation in a student essay, and once, years later, about the ethics of invention, how much imagination an academic might allow himself before crossing into deceit. He had smiled then, faintly, and said that the line between invention and truth was merely a matter of conscience. I had thought him pompous. Now, rereading his name in the quiet of my sitting room, I felt the faintest sting of guilt. Outside, the rain began again, as soft as breath against the window pane. I could hear the slow footsteps of the porter on the cobbles below, his lantern haloed by drizzle. Balliol's chapel light still burned, as though awaiting someone who would never come. Something in the symmetry of that scene, a dead scholar, a living bell, and a city pretending not to notice, refused to settle. It would have been easy to turn the page. But there was a phrase in the notice, 3 simple words that unsettled me. Died at his desk. Few men of Keating's age write to the very end. Fewer still die in the act. The words seemed chosen by someone who admired the irony. I folded the paper and poured another glass, thinking of desks, of ink, of those who mistake the accumulation of notes for the pursuit of truth. I found myself, without clear reason, walking toward Balliol. The rain had grown colder, more deliberate. The porter recognized me, nodded without warmth, and said that Dr. Strange had already notified the authorities. He mentioned, almost casually, that the body was found at first light, that the fellow's door had been locked from within. "Heart failure," he said. "A tidy sort of death, sir." Inside the courtyard, the flagstones were slick, reflecting the faint glow from the chapel windows. The air smelled of paper and wax. Academic decay. I peered through the stairwell where Keating's rooms lay. A single bulb flickered in the corridor. I could see a shadow, perhaps a constable, moving carefully, as though afraid to disturb something older than law. What struck me was the silence. Oxford is never truly quiet, not even at midnight. There is always the hum of bicycles, the whisper of debate, the murmur of rain rehearsing against glass. Yet there, within that ancient quadrangle, time seemed paused, caught in an embarrassed breath. I lingered by the gate and thought of how death, in certain rooms, becomes another kind of scholarship, a study of what was overlooked. Later, back in my flat, I tried to return to Parsifal. The needle clicked faintly before the overture began again, the same wounded chord repeated until it felt like confession. I thought of Keating's handwriting, angular, hesitant, and of the small correction he once made to a student's essay in red ink. Truth misquoted hides the lie. He had written it beneath a misremembered stanza from Yeats. That phrase returned to me now, half accusation, half epitaph. Somewhere between the second movement and silence, I caught myself writing his name on a scrap of paper. Not as a case, not yet. more like a ghost of curiosity. There was no reason to suspect anything beyond the obvious. And yet I have learned, after too many years, too many obituaries, that Oxford seldom permits the obvious to stand unchallenged. When I finally drew the curtains, the bell tolled again, one long, exhausted note spilling into the rain. It sounded less like mourning than revision, as if the city itself were correcting its own memory. I poured the last of the claret, thinking not of death, but of how some men edit their lives until the final draft takes them by surprise. That night I slept poorly, the echo of the bell following me into dreams. Soft, precise, and unbearably patient. I have always distrusted handwriting that leans too far to the right. It suggests a person forever running ahead of her own thoughts, propelled by urgency rather than truth. The poem found among Keating's papers was written in such a hand. Slanted, impatient, beautiful in its carelessness. The lines themselves were uneven, almost gasping for rhythm. It spoke of memory and deceit, of something once promised beside a window in June. I read it twice, then once more. And somewhere between the second and third reading, I knew the author had never intended anyone to see it. Lewis was waiting in the porter's lodge, his notebook damp from the morning drizzle. He said the college secretary believed the poem was an assignment, nothing more. She had smiled, apparently, as she said it, and Morse, meaning myself, should not make a fuss. I thought of that smile as I stood in Keating's study, the stale air still carrying the perfume of dust and ink. The room had not yet adjusted to its vacancy. Chairs held the impressions of the living, books leaned toward conversation. On the desk, beneath the scattered drafts, I found an empty glass ringed with residue of sherry. Not unusual for a man of letters, but I have learned that what a man drinks in solitude often tells more than what he writes for publication. The light from the window fell across a small brass frame. Two faces, faded. Keating, younger by 2 decades, and a woman whose eyes seemed caught between laughter and defiance. There was tenderness there, but also warning. I turned the frame and found an inscription scratched faintly along the edge. E.L., Balliol Gardens, 1981. The same initials as the letter I had seen the day before. Lewis asked whether it meant anything. I said, perhaps everything, though I couldn't yet decide in which language. We lunched in the buttery, a word that promises comfort and never delivers it. The coffee was too bitter, the bread too soft, and the conversation around us a dull hum of dissertations and regret. A young man sat 2 tables away, his shoulders tense beneath an academic gown. He was tearing pages from a notebook with the ritual precision of the guilty. The face was pale, angular, too thoughtful for its age. Simon Granger, Lewis whispered. Postgraduate. Once supervised by Keating. There was a rumor, naturally. There is always a rumor in Oxford, that Granger had withdrawn a thesis at the last moment, citing moral concerns. I watched him shred another page. No one writes that fiercely without confessing to something. It was the crossword that anchored my unease. The Mail had printed a particularly clumsy puzzle that morning, full of pedestrian clues, but one stood apart. Truth, misquoted, hides the lie. 8. The symmetry of it. It was almost Yeats again. I folded the paper and slipped it into my coat. Keating, the academic obsessed with moral deceit, had written that same phrase years earlier in the margin of a student essay. Now it reappeared like an echo rehearsed by chance or guilt. When I finally met Miss Ellen Linton, she was cataloguing books in the college library. Her manner was precise, detached, yet every gesture betrayed history. She spoke of Keating's illness. He had grown forgetful, absent-minded, fond of quoting poets he no longer admired. Her words carried the softness of someone editing her own sorrow. I mentioned the poem. She paused, her eyes fixed on a distant shelf, and said she'd typed most of his correspondence, that the handwriting must belong to a student. Then, as though regretting the speed of her denial, she added that Keating had many admirers. Too many, perhaps. Outside, the rain had returned, fine and persistent, erasing footprints before they could mean anything. Lewis muttered about the futility of poetry in police work, but I wasn't listening. I had noticed a detail, small, absurd, but inescapable. The letter E in the poem's title line was written differently from the rest, a backward curve, deliberate and ornate. The same flourish appeared in Miss Linton's signature on the college visitor ledger. I said nothing. It is sometimes wiser to let evidence breathe before one points to it. By evening, the city was soaked in twilight. The lamplight against wet stone looked like memory reenacted. I walked back toward Broad Street, the poem folded in my pocket, the crossword clue in my hand. Between them lay something both academic and personal, a misquotation, perhaps, that someone had mistaken for absolution. At my rooms, I set the poem on the table beside the paper, poured a measure of whiskey, and watched the ink bleed faintly under the lamplight. Truth misquoted hides the lie. The line was too deliberate to be coincidence. I thought of Keating again, bent over his desk, dying amid his own corrections. Somewhere between the words and the silence, the girl who wrote the poem was waiting to be found. And I, foolishly perhaps, already felt the pull of her voice. There are rooms in Oxford that smell of civility and deceit in equal measure. The senior common room at Balliol was one of them, a quiet chamber where intellect was currency and silence its interest. The fire was already lit when Lewis and I entered, though the warmth did little to disguise the faint chill of rivalry that hung in the air. Books lay open but unread, and 3 cups of coffee steamed as though waiting for their owners to resume an interrupted conversation. They were all there, Vale, Deacon, and the bursar, each one wearing grief as if it had been recently acquired and poorly tailored. Dr. Quentin Vale stood first, smooth-voiced, elegant, his vowels polished by self-approval. He spoke of Keating's brilliance, his fastidious scholarship, his untimely passing. But beneath the eulogy, there was rhythm, rehearsal. I could almost hear him choosing the right adjectives, the way an actor rearranges emphasis. Lewis, who distrusts manners on principle, shifted uneasily. Then came Marian Deacon, professor of ethics, though the word felt misplaced beside her. She had that particular calm of those who no longer expect kindness. Her eyes were pale gray, unblinking. She said little, but when she did, her voice carried the serenity of someone accustomed to being listened to. Keating had been her mentor once, she said, and later her adversary. A difference in philosophical approach. I watched the way she folded her hands when she said it, left thumb covering right, as if restraining something from speech. The bursar, a man whose name eludes me now, fretted about finances. There had been discrepancies in the endowment fund. Minor, he claimed, though his eyes flickered toward Vale as he spoke. It seemed Keating had taken a personal interest in an account previously left to committee oversight. The word withdrawal surfaced briefly before vanishing into a polite cough. I made a note of it silently. Money has a way of rewriting philosophy. Lewis, never one for subtleties, asked whether Keating had enemies. Vale smiled, the sort of smile meant to close a door. Only those jealous of his intellect, he said. It was then I noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he set his cup down. The porcelain clicked once, like punctuation on a lie. Afterward I lingered near the mantelpiece, pretending to study the portrait of a long-dead warden. Its gilt frame reflected just enough light for me to see their faces behind me. 3 scholars orbiting one another with academic precision, careful not to touch. I remembered a line from Keating's lecture years ago, something about truth being a form of negotiation. I wondered how often he'd applied that principle outside the classroom. When they had gone, I walked the perimeter of the room. The air was heavy with polish and old conversations. On the table near the window, a folded copy of the Times literary supplement lay abandoned. I opened it absently and found a small note scribbled in the margin beside a review of Yeats' letters. The misquotation reveals more than the line itself. The handwriting was unmistakable. Keating's, but the date was 2 weeks old. Lewis re-entered, muttering about the porter's gossip, something about a student visiting Keating late on the night he died. A young man, tall, dark coat, carrying papers. No one had caught his name. I asked whether the porter might identify him again. Lewis shrugged. Perhaps. But the look he gave me said it wouldn't matter. In Oxford, everyone wears the same coat. As we left, the wind moved through the quad, turning the rain into threads that stitched the darkness together. I paused beneath the archway, hearing the echo of Vale's voice. Admiration polished to contempt, affection disguised as eulogy. Behind it all, the whisper of a single line from the poem. We write until our lies become legible. That evening, in my rooms, I unfolded the newspaper clipping again. The crossword clue that had haunted me now revealed another layer. 8 letters. Deceiver. I filled it in, then crossed it out. Too simple, I thought. In Oxford, deceit is never an act. It's an education, and the senior common room, for all its civility, was the classroom. It was raining when Lewis brought me the envelope. It always seems to rain in Oxford when truth begins to leak. He'd found it among the debris on Keating's desk, a small, cream-colored envelope, unposted, its flap still sealed. The handwriting was deliberate, almost painfully neat, the sort that betrays someone accustomed to correction. The address was written simply, E.L., Balliol Lodge. No title, no surname. The intimacy of omission. We sat in the porter's room, a space that always smells faintly of varnish and resignation. Lewis tapped the envelope against his notebook, wondering aloud whether it might matter. I told him everything mattered, though rarely in the way we expect. He handed it over with a shrug and poured himself a cup of the porter's tea. I held the letter for a while before opening it, as though the paper might confess its story through the fingertips. Inside, only one sheet, folded once. The words, "I forgive you, but I cannot forget." Nothing else. No signature, no date. I read it 3 times, but the sentence remained stubbornly evasive. It was not an accusation, nor quite an absolution. It was something stranger, an echo of intimacy left deliberately incomplete. I took it to Miss Linton that afternoon. She was in her office, a narrow room with 2 filing cabinets, a vase of dry lilies, and a clock that ticked too loudly. She greeted me with the careful courtesy of someone who has already decided how much she intends to reveal. I told her about the letter. For a moment, she was motionless, as if time itself had paused to watch. Then she smiled, a small rehearsed expression, and said she'd never seen it before. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but I noticed the slightest indentation on her middle finger, the pale mark left by a ring no longer worn. She spoke of Keating with the precise neutrality of a secretary discussing a colleague's pension form. A fine scholar, she said, forgetful sometimes. Kind in his way, but distant. She had typed for him for nearly 20 years. I asked if they'd ever disagreed. She said everyone disagreed with him, that it was part of his charm. I asked if she'd ever written him a letter. She hesitated just long enough for truth to pass through the silence before answering no. When I left, she was rearranging her papers, but her fingers trembled slightly, aligning the corners too carefully. Lewis met me outside under the dripping eaves and asked if I believed her. I told him belief was a luxury best reserved for the clergy. That night I couldn't sleep. I poured a measure of whiskey and stared at the letter under the lamplight. I forgive you, but I cannot forget. The phrase troubled me not for what it said, but for its rhythm. The syntax was oddly formal, like something translated from another tongue, or borrowed from literature. I reached for the nearest book on my shelf, Keating's own volume on romantic correspondence, and leafed through it. Halfway through the introduction, there it was, a quotation from an obscure 19th century poet. "Forgive, but forget not, for memory is the proof of mercy." Keating had underlined it, faintly, in pencil. The next morning, Lewis reported that Keating's bank records showed a withdrawal of £500 the day before his death. No one knew why. No debts, no gambling, no mistresses that anyone cared to admit. I told Lewis to find out whether the sum had been given to anyone at the college. He said he'd try, though with that expression that means he thinks I'm chasing shadows. In truth, I wasn't sure myself. Yet something about the letter, the politeness of its phrasing, the restraint of its wound, felt less like guilt and more like penance. A scholar's attempt at moral accounting. I imagined Keating at his desk, writing those words with the precision of a man trying to make peace through grammar. And then, for reasons I couldn't yet define, deciding never to send them. Later, walking across Broad Street, I saw Miss Linton in the distance, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She paused at the post box, hesitated, and then turned away without posting whatever she held. There are moments when observation feels like intrusion, yet curiosity is its own vocation. I watched her disappear beneath the colonnade, her figure swallowed by the rain. That night, the letter lay on my desk like an accusation. I considered returning it to the envelope, sealing it once more, letting it die the quiet death Keating intended. Instead, I left it open. The ink had begun to fade as if retreating from the page. I forgive you, but I cannot forget. Perhaps forgiveness, like truth, was a form of self-deception, a letter always meant to return to sender. The Bodleian always smells of dust and judgment. Every corridor seems to hold its breath, as though the books resent the living for interrupting their long sleep. That morning, a clerk led me through the upper reading rooms toward the restricted collection. The sound of my footsteps followed like punctuation in a silent argument. Keating had signed into this room 2 days before his death. That fact alone should not have mattered. Professors lived half their lives beneath those dim lamps. Yet there had been something curious in the record. A withdrawn thesis, marked confidential, removed under his name and never returned. The clerk, a pale man whose glasses magnified his unease, said the title softly as though it were a secret in itself. The Ethics of Fabrication. The author, Simon Granger. He'd written it 3 years earlier, then abruptly withdrawn it before examination. The reason listed was personal integrity. I felt the faint stir of irony. The shelves pressed close, tall enough to make one feel judged by height alone. I asked to see Keating's seat, a simple oak desk, immaculate, no trace of use except for the indentation of a pen in the blotter. The clerk said he'd left early that day, complaining of the light. I thanked him and asked for a copy of the withdrawal slip. He hesitated, then fetched it. The signature was Keating's, but the date had been altered. Not crudely, so precisely that only habit would have made me notice the difference in ink tone. I felt a small tremor of satisfaction, the old whisper that comes when a lie begins to surface. Outside, the air was bright and colorless. I found Granger in the Turf Tavern, hunched over a whiskey he couldn't afford. The place was almost empty. Morning drinkers seldom require company. He looked at me as though already accused. I said I wasn't there to judge, though judgment is the only language Oxford ever speaks fluently. He muttered that the thesis had been an experiment, half philosophy, half confession. Keating had supervised it, then told him to destroy it. I asked why. He stared into the glass. Because it was true, he said. Too true, perhaps. He'd written about deception in academia, about the way a footnote can hide an entire falsehood if it's dressed properly. He'd meant it as metaphor, but Keating had taken it personally. He'd called it slander, and later, he paused, swallowing hard. He'd offered money for silence. There was a moment then, brief but raw, where youth's arrogance trembled into remorse. I asked where the manuscript was now. "Gone," he said. He'd brought it to the Bodleian to withdraw it officially, but Keating must have taken it afterward. He claimed he didn't know why. Perhaps to protect himself, perhaps to rewrite it under his own name. Oxford is full of thefts that wear the disguise of mentorship. When I left the pub, the rain had begun, the kind that falls quietly enough to make you think. I walked toward the library again, my mind pacing faster than my steps. The missing thesis, the altered date, the bank withdrawal. Each detail aligning like words in a half-solved crossword. Lewis met me outside the Clarendon steps, coat collar up, expression wary. He'd found something. Keating had borrowed a typewriter from the porter's office the day before his death, supposedly to finish a paper for publication. The ribbon was missing. A trivial thing, perhaps, but I have learned that trivial things rarely remain so. I told Lewis to find the machine and have it checked. He frowned, asked what I expected to find. I told him nothing. It was easier than explaining that I rarely know what I'm looking for until I've already found it. That evening, I returned alone to the Bodleian. The porter let me in reluctantly, muttering about regulations. I stood in the manuscript room once more, the silence deeper than before. I looked at Keating's seat, then at the window beyond it. Rain traced fragile lines down the glass, thin as handwriting. It occurred to me that deception, too, leaves its own calligraphy, visible only when light strikes at the right angle. I leaned over the desk and noticed something beneath the blotter, a torn slip of paper, its corner still clinging to the wood. I lifted it carefully. The fragment bore a single typed line. Truth requires its own fiction to survive. The words were centered as though meant for an epigraph. Keating's ribbon, Granger's title, the ethics of fabrication, all of it part of the same unfinished text. I folded the fragment and placed it in my pocket. The rain outside softened to a rhythm almost musical, and for a moment I imagined Keating sitting exactly there, surrounded by the ghosts of books that had outlived their authors, trying to write one final correction into his own life. Oxford slept above me, oblivious. The manuscript room remained dark, patient, waiting for the next man who believed he could edit the truth. The roads to Woodstock are always lonelier in autumn. The fields look older, their edges blurred by drizzle, as if even the countryside has begun to lose its certainty. Lewis drove, grumbling about the pointlessness of visiting another academic, while I watched the hedgerows vanish into mist. I told him that wills, like poems, often reveal more than their authors intend. He didn't reply. He rarely does when my sentences begin that way. Marion Deacon lived in a small cottage set back from the road, hidden by a row of yews that seemed to lean in conspiratorially. The door opened before we reached it, as though she'd been waiting. She was not what I expected. Austere, perhaps, but not cold. There was an inwardness about her, a gravity that drew one's attention and deflected it at the same time. She offered us coffee and turned to the window while I studied the room. Paintings half finished leaned against the walls. Books on art and ethics lay stacked on the table. On the mantel stood an empty wine bottle, used as a vase, holding a single withered tulip. She spoke of Keating with the composure of someone reading from a script long memorized. He had been her colleague, her rival, and, in some dimly forgotten season, her friend. They had disagreed, she said, on the nature of truth in art. He believed beauty could redeem deceit. She did not. She smiled faintly at the irony of that. Lewis shifted uncomfortably, waiting for me to ask about the will. When I mentioned it, she nodded as if unsurprised. He had left her a collection of rare wines, she said. An odd bequest, considering she scarcely drank. She had tried to refuse it, but the solicitor insisted. I asked whether she knew why he chose her. Her gaze fell on the bottle by the mantelpiece. Because once, long ago, he promised to teach me the difference between good wine and great wine. But he never quite managed it. She poured a little from a dusty bottle of Montrachet she'd kept unopened since the news of his death. The cork broke in her hands. I offered help. She declined. The wine was pale gold, luminous even in the dim light. She handed me a glass and asked, almost absently, whether I believed in forgiveness. I said it depended who was asking. She smiled again, a small, inward thing. Then she said that Keating's lectures had grown darker in recent years. Less about literature, more about guilt disguised as moral theory. She wondered aloud if he'd ever written anything honest. When we left, the rain had eased. Lewis muttered that academics like to talk until the truth drowned. I agreed, though not aloud. Something in the room had unsettled me. The bottle, perhaps, or the faint smell of turpentine beneath the scent of cork and dust. As we walked to the car, I glanced back through the window. She was rearranging the books, her face turned away, her hand resting for a moment on the spine of one volume, out of order with the rest. Final draft, Balliol Papers. That evening I dined alone at the Randolph. The waiter brought the wine list. I scanned it idly until my eye caught a familiar name. Keating Reserve, 1983. I smiled at the arrogance of the label, but the vintage was genuine. Only 3 cases had ever been bottled. One of them, I now realized, sat in Marion Deacon's cellar. I made a small deduction then, not of guilt, but of intimacy. There are gifts that disguise themselves as indulgence, and there are others that linger like confession. I returned home and opened my notebook. On one page I wrote, "The will, wine, truth fermented, unfinished lesson." Below it, I added a line from the crossword I'd filled earlier that morning. Preserve that which ripens with time. 6. I hadn't solved it then, but now the answer came easily. Memory. I poured myself a final glass of whiskey and let the thought settle. Keating's last act had not been generosity. It had been apology. A man who knew that some truths, like certain wines, must breathe before they are finally understood. The rain began again. I left the window open, the sound mingling with the faint clink of glass. Outside, Oxford slept. Inside, the bottle on my desk caught the lamplight and turned it to gold. An echo of the Montrachet, of promises deferred, of something left uncorked between the living and the dead. There are mornings in Oxford when even the air seems reluctant to begin again. That one came with a thin frost and the sound of chapel bells muffled by fog. I sat by the window, the crossword folded against the saucer of my cup, the ink bleeding faintly where the steam had reached it. Most days I start there, among clues and half-truths, small puzzles that imitate the larger ones life insists on setting. One clue arrested me more than the rest. Where truth sleeps, say line 11, 5. At first I dismissed it as a construction too self-conscious for elegance, but something in it lingered. Line 11. I reached for the poem we had found among Keating's papers, the one that had begun all this, handwritten, tender, and unsigned. I counted slowly, my pencil tapping against the edge of the desk. Line 11. Every lie leaves love as residue. The first letter of each line, when read downward, spelled a name, E-L-L-Y. I don't remember whether I stood or sat back down. The satisfaction of deduction is a thin pleasure, somewhere between hunger and shame. I thought of Ellen Linton, her careful hands, the way she avoided meeting my eyes when truth crept too near. I had suspected before, of course. Now the suspicion had grown a pulse. I found her at her lodgings on Holywell Street, a narrow terrace that smelled of coal and carnations. She opened the door without surprise, as though she had been waiting. The room behind her was dim, papers stacked in quiet accusation upon the desk. I told her what I'd found. She turned away, not to hide tears. There were none, but to light a cigarette with trembling precision. "Yes," she said at last. "I wrote it, but not for him." She meant Keating. Her voice softened around the name, though the bitterness beneath it remained sharp. She had loved him once, or thought she had. That was punishment. Enough. "The poem," she said, "was meant as an ending, not a beginning." I asked whether he had ever read it. She shook her head, then hesitated. Perhaps. He had a way of reading what wasn't his. She looked toward the window, where the light barely moved. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. He'd promised to protect her sister. The younger one, bright, impulsive, a student in his tutorials years ago. She had drowned one summer in Port Meadow. Accident, they'd called it. But Ellen had never believed that. There had been a letter then too, she said. One she never saw, only heard about. From Keating. An apology, perhaps, or a denial. She would never know. Her words came quietly, each syllable measured, as though emotion must first pass through grammar before it was safe to speak. When she paused, the silence pressed close between us, and for a moment I could hear the faint hum of the street outside, the clip of a bicycle chain, a child calling somewhere beyond the fog. She asked whether he had suffered. I said he had died at his desk, and that the end, as far as anyone knew, was gentle. I didn't tell her that his hand had still clutched a pen, or that the ink had spilled like confession across the final page. Before I left, I noticed an envelope resting on her mantelpiece. It bore no address, only the faint indentation of a name now rubbed away. She caught me looking and smiled. "Some things," she said, "are best left unread." Outside, the mist had begun to thin, revealing the spires in outline, ghosts of architecture returning to form. Lewis waited by the car, stamping his feet for warmth. He asked if we'd learned anything new. I told him we had learned enough to make the truth uncomfortable, which is all truth ever does. Back at my rooms, I unfolded the crossword again. The clue still waited, patient as guilt, where truth sleeps. The answer came suddenly, though I'm not sure what guided it. 5 letters. Heart. I wrote it in ink, then stared at it until it blurred. Keating's heart had failed, or so the doctor said. But perhaps it hadn't failed so much as surrendered. To guilt, to longing, to whatever it is that keeps scholars writing when the words have already turned against them. That night, before turning out the light, I placed the poem beside the crossword on my desk. The two lay side by side like lovers who no longer needed to speak. In their silence, I thought I heard the faintest echo of a woman's voice. Calm, resigned, almost tender, saying that forgiveness is simply another word for forgetting too late. And somewhere in that echo, Oxford exhaled again, its secrets intact, waiting for morning. There are kinds of silence particular to fire. The crackle, the hiss, the soft implosion of paper turning back into ash. All of it forms a language of erasure. I stood outside Balliol that night, watching the smoke rise from the rooms of Dr. Quentin Vale. The fire brigade moved with the efficiency of those who have seen too much human negligence. But this was no accident. I knew that the moment I saw the way the flames had started low, steady, determined. Not wild, but deliberate. A scholar's fire, precise in its destruction. Lewis said something about faulty wiring. I let him have his theory for a minute before asking whether he had ever known a scholar who risked setting fire to first editions by accident. He frowned, muttered something about my cynicism, and turned back to the smoke. When the last of the embers were out, the corridor still smelled of charred glue and varnish. I stepped inside. Vale's desk had been pulled clear of the flames, but the books around it were nothing more than brittle skeletons of thought. A few sheets of paper had survived, half-burned, their corners curling like old petals. One of them bore a faint imprint of a sentence. Ethics and invention share a border unpoliced. Keating's phrase, lifted word for word from his last lecture. Lewis said he'd found Vale unconscious when they broke in, overcome by the smoke. The doctor at the infirmary called it mild poisoning. I called it an inconvenient recovery. Later, I sat beside Vale's bed. The room was too white, too clean. He looked smaller without his wit, an empty gown folded over bones. When he spoke, it was with that languid drawl that had once charmed undergraduates into believing ambiguity was an art form. He said the fire was an accident. He said Keating's death was an accident too. He said many things, but I was listening for what he didn't say. On the bedside table lay a single book that had somehow escaped the blaze, the collected essays of Ambrose Keating. It was an early edition, margins thick with Vale's penciled notes. I turned a page and saw a small correction in red ink, almost invisible, but not quite. Keating had once written, "Art redeems deceit." Vale had amended it to read, "Deceit redeems art." The difference was small, the consequence enormous. I asked him why he'd made the change. He smiled faintly and said, "Habit. Some of us can't resist revising the dead." Back in my rooms, I poured myself a whiskey and laid the scorched page beside the crossword from the morning paper. I stared at both until the room began to tilt. 2 clues waited, each promising too much. One from the paper, false note, misplaced source, 7. And the other from Keating's manuscript, where a footnote cited an essay that never existed. I had noticed it days earlier, but dismissed it as oversight. Now, with Vale's correction still burning behind my eyes, the oversight became motive. I returned to the college the next day. The porter eyed me with the weary resignation of a man who knows inquiry is a contagion that spreads faster than fire. In Vale's rooms, the librarian had begun cataloguing what was left. Among the debris lay a folder of proofs, Keating's final article, annotated in 2 distinct hands. One was his own, sharp, cramped, a man in dialogue with himself. The other was Vale's, smoother, confident, the handwriting of someone editing for posterity. But the postscript, the part that had made Keating's reputation, was in neither hand. A forgery, quiet as breath. Lewis arrived with the report. No accelerant detected, though the ignition point was clear, the desk lamp. A scholar's instrument turned weapon. I nodded absently, my attention on the margins. There, among Vale's annotations, I found the smallest clue. A single reference misquoted, a footnote that cited a page number too low by 1. It was an error of precision, but not of ignorance. Someone had moved the truth slightly, just enough to make it unfindable. Outside, the afternoon light was fading to that uncertain shade of silver peculiar to Oxford winters. The bell from Merton sounded, distant and sorrowful. I folded the proof pages and slipped them into my coat. That evening, as I walked past the Radcliffe camera, I thought about forgery. Not the grand, clumsy kind that imitates signatures, but the quiet revisions, edits made out of pride or love, that alter meaning by increments. Keating had built his career on the sanctity of sources. Vale had dismantled it with a single citation. Between them stood Ellen Linton, the poem, the will, the wine, each an annotation in a larger deception. In my rooms, I filled in the crossword. False note, misplaced source. The answer came before I finished the whiskey. Forgery. I set the paper aside and stared at the word. It looked too simple, too clean for the thing it described. Oxford breeds such deceptions effortlessly. Ideas borrowed, emotions misattributed, guilt published under another's name. Outside, the wind rose, stirring the ash that still clung to my coat. Somewhere across the city, a bell chimed the hour, and I thought, perhaps not for the first time, that in the end, all scholarship burns the same way, slowly, beautifully, and without apology. It is strange how memory alters light. What once shone too brightly dulls with time, while what was dim gains a cruel precision. I remember the photograph now, not as I first saw it. Half-burned, edges curled like dying leaves, but as it became later, whole again beneath my lamp, its shadows heavier than before. The fire in Vale's rooms had destroyed nearly everything, yet one scrap of image had survived. Keating's face, turned slightly away, and the shoulder of a woman cropped from the frame. It was Lewis who brought me the rest, folded in an evidence envelope, the edges singed but still breathing with color. He said the clerk had found it behind the radiator in the manuscript room, as though it had hidden there to wait for someone willing to remember. I pieced it together on my desk, the joins uneven, the surface cracked where heat had warped the emulsion. 3 faces. Keating in the center, younger, hair darker, eyes still carrying the vanity of the admired. To his left, Marian Deacon, a hand resting lightly on his arm. To his right, Osani, woman I had not seen before, though something in the set of her mouth stirred an uneasy recognition. It was Ellen Linton's sister, the drowned one. The photograph had been taken years earlier, perhaps at Port Meadow, the river a blurred silver behind them. They looked too happy for academics. Or perhaps they were simply too young to know how brief happiness allows itself to be photographed. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it meant they had all known one another more intimately than any of them had admitted. He asked how I could be sure. I pointed to a detail so small it could have passed unnoticed. The shadow of a hand, not Deacon's, resting against the drowned girl's shoulder. Keating's hand, his ring just visible, the gold catching a trick of light, the ring that was missing when his body was found. Lewis said I was imagining connections. I told him imagination was merely deduction without apology. He laughed, called me a poet, and left to fetch sandwiches neither of us would eat. Later, alone, I studied the photograph again. The inscription on the back had survived the fire better than the faces had. To A.K., with truth. The handwriting was delicate, confident. Female, the same hand, I now realized, that had written the poem. I walked to the river that evening. Oxford was wrapped in its familiar dusk, the color of pewter, the scent of cold water and chimney smoke. Somewhere, a college choir rehearsed, their voices carrying faintly through the mist. I sat on the bench near the meadow and watched the slow ripples beneath the bridge. A heron stood motionless on the opposite bank, as if guarding something submerged. The girl had drowned here years ago. An accident, they'd said, though accidents seldom choose so poetic a stage. I tried to picture the scene. The river catching her reflection, the grass bending under her weight as she stepped too near the edge. And then Keating, perhaps, arriving too late, the guilt curdling into scholarship. There was a deduction forming, fragile and disobedient, as most deductions are. The missing thesis, the forged footnotes, the letter of forgiveness, the poem written as confession. They were not fragments, but layers, each concealing the other. Keating had not plagiarized Vale's work. Vale had stolen Keating's, and in that theft lay the origin of everything that followed. The death, the guilt, the desperate revisions of the past. But the photograph complicated things. It tied them all to an older tragedy, one that refused to stay buried. I thought of Ellen Linton again, her trembling hand, her refusal to post the letter. She had inherited not just her sister's face, but her silence. When I returned to my rooms, the photograph still lay on the desk, half in shadow. I poured a whiskey and looked at it until the faces blurred into abstraction. I wondered whether Keating had kept it as a reminder or as punishment. The inscription, with truth, seemed both gift and accusation. I turned it over once more. Beneath the dedication, barely visible, a faint second line appeared under the lamplight. Ink faded to brown, almost erased. Forgive me the footnote I became. I closed my eyes. Somewhere beyond the window, a bell began to toll, the same patient rhythm that seems to count for every loss in this city. Lewis would call in the morning with something practical: the bank records, the typewriter ribbon, the laboratory report on the ash. Facts arranged in order, obedient to evidence. But tonight I preferred the disorder of thought. The river kept its secrets, the photograph kept its ghosts, and I, like Keating, kept drinking. Truth, I have learned, never survives without the mercy of revision. And Oxford, ever faithful, edits us all in the end. There are endings that refuse to behave like endings. They arrive quietly, half concealed beneath the ordinary. A late letter, a misplaced key, the faint clink of a glass. The Keating case ended that way. Not with revelation, nor with triumph, but with the soft exhaustion that comes when truth has been wrestled into coherence, yet remains slightly out of reach. I remember sitting alone in Balliol Chapel that night, the air steeped in wax and candle smoke. The pews were empty, the silence carried its own architecture. Outside, the quadrangle glistened with the remnants of rain. I had come, I think, to see whether the dead ever find contentment among their own ruins. The clerk had handed me Keating's final lecture that afternoon, typed, bound, and left in a folder marked draft. It was not the lecture he had planned to give. It was, instead, a letter to no one in particular, a confession masquerading as philosophy. I read it there under the chapel light, the paper trembling faintly in my hand. All scholars write their own obituaries. He had begun, sentence by sentence. It was a curious line, too poetic for academia, too academic for poetry. He wrote of falsifications and footnotes, of the temptation to beautify one's own mistakes. He mentioned names indirectly, as though invoking ghosts. I could hear his voice in every pause, that mixture of brilliance and fatigue that had once filled lecture halls. And somewhere between the paragraphs, he had slipped in a single line that changed everything. The truth was never mine to publish. It belonged to the girl who drowned. Lewis had read the same page, though his reaction had been less sentimental. He said it proved guilt, but not murder. I told him guilt was the only proof that ever mattered. He looked at me the way one looks at a friend who's wandered too far into abstraction and muttered something about the coroner. But I couldn't let it rest. That evening, I returned to Marion Deacon's cottage in Woodstock. The gate was unlatched, the light still burning behind the curtains. She didn't seem surprised to see me, only tired. On the table beside her were 2 glasses and a bottle of Montrachet, the same one she'd opened weeks before. She poured without asking. I told her about the lecture. She listened, silent, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Then she said, almost to herself, that Keating had never known how to stop revising, that even his remorse came edited. She confessed that she had found him that night, slumped over the desk, the letter beside him. She had chosen not to call anyone immediately. Instead, she'd sat there until dawn, watching the ink dry. Why? I asked. Because I wanted to see whether truth, once written, could keep him alive a little longer. There was no accusation in her voice, no self-pity, only the faintest tremor of memory. When I asked whether she'd known about the forged article, the footnotes, the fire, she nodded. Vale's ambition had always exceeded his integrity. He had doctored Keating's manuscripts to secure tenure. Keating had discovered it too late. The confession in the lecture was his way of dying tidily. And yet, she said, he didn't die from guilt. He died from exhaustion, the scholar's disease. As I left, she handed me a single sheet from the folder, a page Keating had torn out. The last paragraph, she called it. You'll want to read it alone. I read it later that night, back in my rooms. The lamp hummed faintly, and the crossword lay unfinished beside the glass. The paragraph began without preamble. If anyone reads this, tell them I tried to correct the error. Tell them that truth once borrowed cannot be returned unmarked. And tell the one who waited by the river, that forgiveness was always hers to give. I thought of Ellen Linton, the quiet ache in her voice, the letter she never posted. I thought of her sister, the drowned girl, her name fading from records like ink left in sunlight. I thought of all of us, writers, liars, lovers, trying to translate regret into language. Lewis called the next morning to say the file was closed. The cause of death remained the same, cardiac failure with notes of whiskey and irony. Vale had resigned, citing ill health. Marion Deacon had left Oxford. Ellen Linton, I was told, had moved to a seaside town where the tides erase footprints as faithfully as confession erases sin. I went once more to the river. The water was low that day, the reeds bent under their own reflection. I dropped the final page into the current. The paper darkened, folded, then drifted away, its ink dissolving into silence. That night, back in the chapel, I thought of Keating's words again. All scholars write their own obituaries. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps every investigation is just another draft, every deduction a revision of our own failings. The candles guttered. The last bell sounded. I finished the whiskey and closed my notebook. Somewhere beyond the cloisters, Oxford exhaled, indifferent as ever. And I, who had followed truth to its final punctuation, could not help wondering whether forgiveness was simply another word for the footnote one never writes.